was up at Geyser and I got to practice this once, Trig, so and I only forgot one man, so I'm going to try not to this time. So essentially over the years, for when I was a younger man, like most of us, we had World War II relatives that most of us didn't know much about. They didn't tell us, we didn't ask, and it kind of, our lives went on and we didn't learn as much as we should have. Well, about 20 years ago, I got kind of interested and became kind of the dog on the bone and started chasing this story. And I've kind of determined that Judith Basin County was pretty special during World War II. There were, at one point in the war, in the mid-40s, Judith Basin County had led the state of Montana in recruitment at 597% of its quota. So probably most of you would not guess how many Judith Basin County vets were in World War II. Well, I've chased and I've looked and I've found every source I can possibly find, and I've came up with about 580 of them from this county, just Judith Basin County. Pretty amazing number, I think. And they were all over the world. They served. Some lost their lives. Some were prisoners, but they went and did that. And I'm going to talk mainly about the killed in action today. There were 23 just from the county, and then I'm going to include 4 or 5 others that are connected. So as I go through this, I'll kind of go through it chronologically, but kind of as a number for you. Of those roughly 28 men, there was only none killed in Germany, 1 in France at Paris, 2 in Italy, 1 in the Atlantic, 2 stateside, and 22 of them in the Pacific. Kind of an odd balance of number because we had probably just as many men in Europe as we did in the Pacific. But one of the things that really contributed to that, of course, was the Bataan March and the prison camps of the Philippines. So as I go through, I'll kind of talk about that. But it kind of reminds me of a quote I came up with that Winston Churchill said it best, and like he did a lot of things, he said it best. He said, "Never before had so many owed so much to so few." Very true. So I guess that's why I kind of got interested in it, got fired up about it, and I'm really glad to be able to share it. Because like I told the guys at Geyser, what does history have in common with manure and money? You guess, Trig? They're all better if they're spread. Here we are. I'm spreading a little. Well, when the war started, to chase these men down, it's kind of hard to find. There's not just a database you go to find out, what happened to them. You got to dig around and dig around. And one guy that I've really been able to not find much about, and Joe Vavrowski's tried to help me, and I can't find George Kuhn much about him. He was the first to die. It was in October of 1940. He went overboard in a ship in the Atlantic. That's about all I know about him. So he was the first. Then we had Pearl Harbor. The United States gets into the war, both sides of the world, and none of our men were killed at Pearl Harbor. We did have a couple wounded. But then Pearl Harbor, at the same time, there was Clark Field in the Philippines when the Japanese took Clark Field. And from there was a retreat to Bataan Peninsula of our men and women. And our great General MacArthur maybe had a pretty big lapse there because he didn't have enough rice or medical supplies, equipment, anything. And our men had to go, our whole Bataan contingency had to go on half rations as of the 1st of January 1942. So the battling bastards of Bataan is what they were called. They fought through until April when they surrendered. And of course the United States was gearing up to get into the war big and strong by that point. We had to stop the Japs from continuing to advance through Southeast Asia. And one of the first places we had to go was New Guinea and the Guadalcanal. On the way to get our men to New Guinea in February 19th of 1942, our first casualty during the war happened. That was Basil Skelton. That would have been Bill's second cousin. His dad and mom were Mr. and Mrs. Bert Skelton. And he was killed while manning a .50 caliber during a Zero attack in the Darwin in the Northern Territories of Australia. So he passed away first. When he left, he said that when the smoke clears, I'll be back home, take care of my horses. He had 6 sisters, you know, tough deal on a family. Well, during this time, our prisoners, they weren't prisoners in Baton yet. There were 5 from our county that were in Baton. There's actually 6 in Baton. One of them ended up in Corregidor also. Of the 5 men in Baton, and I'm very honored to have a couple of the family members of these Baton people, Jean Todd's uncle, Raymond Bullard, Wanda Brownlee, her uncle, cousin was one. So those were 2. Raymond Bullard lived out where the Hedrick, Patty and Larry Hedrick live now. Ends up in the Philippines, ends up through Baton. They surrender at the end of April. He ends up in O'Donnell. They go on the, so it would be Lawrence McAllister from Geyser. He would have been actually Pat O.J.'s father. Clifford Turner from Stanford. Raymond Bullard, Raymond Brownlee, Art Cervenka from up at Benchland. And they were all on the Baton March. They marched 65 miles in terrible conditions. They then were stuffed on train cars and ended up in O'Donnell, which was called Camp Death. By the end of May, 1,500 of them had died in Camp O'Donnell. Art Cervenka was the first to die May 11th of 42, or May 12th. By June 11th, what's the next one? Lawrence McAllister died June 11th. June 30th, Raymond Bullard. July 28th, Clifford Turner. And September, Raymond Brownlee, September 28th. So by that point, we had 5 of our men that were prisoners that basically starved to death and died the hard way. There were 2 others over there. Roland Nelson was in Corregidor, and a man named John Sloan he was born in 1906, so he was 37 years old roughly. He was a platoon sergeant with the Marines, and he fought all the way through Baton, but then went to Corregidor. They surrendered about a month later. So they didn't have to go on the march, but they ended up in Cabanatuan is where those men went. John Sloan survived until next February of 43, and then he died. Roland Nelson got to take a ride on a hell ship. I'll tell you a little about that here in a bit. Ended up in Tokyo in a coal mine. Roland was Manly Nelson's brother. And he survived, and he had a fairly short life because of his health troubles. He died at 51. So the Japanese camps were tough, and what were we going to do about it? What was America going to do? Well, they had to go to Guadalcanal, and they had to stop at Midway. Before that, in June of 1942, some of you may have seen or know about the Midway. That's a pretty important part of the war. Japs were going to try to take Midway. Pretty much would have controlled the entire Pacific, and it would have been pretty tough to shake them out of there. Maybe even Hawaii. Well, a man that's buried right over on the other side of the cars there is a man named James Arnold Shelton. And he was a pilot. 1934 graduate of Denton. He grew up about by Glen Todd's in the Judith Basin side. And he became a pilot, a fighter pilot. He flew a SBD dive bomber. And after the Japanese had pretty much wiped out all our planes at Midway, the first several attempts, and it didn't look very good about 10:25 that morning. Japs were rearming. We had 2 carriers, they had 4. Just, it just didn't look very good. Well, fortunately, we had a guy named James Arnold Shelton who flew with Ward McCluskey in what was called Task Force 6. If you study Midway, it's the most famous task force. These were the guys that changed the course of the war. 16 of them, 16 pilots and their gunners. 20,000 feet. There they are. Now, if you've seen the movies, imagine dropping 20,000 feet and having the wherewithal to drop your bombs and do what you're supposed to do and then get away. Well, James Arnold Shelton did. And he flew with McCluskey, and they hit the Kaga and the Akaji, and they sunk the first 2. He escaped, flew with some Zeros, or flew to escape some Zeros, and ended up with 5 other planes. One of them ended up surviving and told the story, and James never made it home. He died at sea and never found the Enterprise. But we stopped them at Midway. And that was a big course of the war. Sunk 4 carriers right there. So the next place was Guadalcanal. Our men were dying in Baton, so everybody wanted to do what they could to get there. In Guadalcanal, the Marines had gone in, and we had several of our Judith Basin men in Guadalcanal as Marines and some infantry or Army men. None of them were killed that way, but we had a pilot from Moccasin, Gordon Thompson, who came in. The Navy had to pretty much exit because there were several big battles and they couldn't stay in there, so the Marines were kind of abandoned or isolated, and they had to get some air fire or air support. So in came Gordon Thompson with the Cactus Air Squadron, and he was flying a Wildcat, and I can't believe these guys were this high, but they were up at 25,000 feet. This is at the end of August, the first ones to come in to help save these men and at least give them air support in Guadalcanal. Well, Gordon goes up on August 31st, and 3 of the planes of the squadron lose their oxygen, and all 3 go down, and Gordon is missing in action until June of 2018. A farmer in Guadalcanal finds his dog tags. So they do the DNA testing. They end up interning him in 22 or 3, was it? 23, I think, at Moccasin. And I got to speak at that, and a very distinct honor. And he got interned there, and that's where I met Wanda. And I tried to tell a little bit of story about the Moccasin Indians. That's the story. Because Moccasin had a lot of fighting men. The numbers in our counties, when you break that 580 down, it's pretty fascinating. Between Colon, Benchland, and Moccasin, just on that bench up there, there were 98 of them. 98. I mean, big families, some 4 or 5 brothers, quite a few of those. Stanford, 155 of them from here. Geyser had 88. Wyndham, 74 of them. So, you can imagine, they're just everybody. And of course, families were large, and people were probably poor, and they said, well, why not? So they took off. Guadalcanal then fights through the end of 1942. We take control in February, and that fight kind of ends. New Guinea goes on for about 2 years. It's just that brutal battle through the whole thing. A lot of our local guys went there. Glenn Lilligard, Glenn Gore, quite a few others were in New Guinea, and they fought there for quite a while. Well, as the 1942 wore down, Stalingrad's going on in Russia. We're not on the continent yet in Europe. November of 42, we fight the French in French Morocco and end up in North Africa. So then that starts, and there's a couple of our guys, your dad, Elmer Metcalf, Carl Lindsay, Jack Pancakes, one that lost his life later, William Galt. These are all of our guys that were fighting through northern Africa, and some through Sicily and then into Italy in 1943 and then 1944. The only other death in 1943 besides John Sloan, the Marine Corps platoon in Philippines, was a man named Daniel Thorson, and he was from Hughesville. He ended up, he was a fighter pilot, and testing a plane out of Connecticut. He was the other stateside man. He got iced up or somehow a bad storm, and he went down, and that's how he lost his life. So it was just the 2 in 1942. But then 1944 rolls around, and things are getting pretty hot by then. We're all over the world. Italy is Monte Cassino, and then Anzio, where we got kind of stuck on the beach, and the Germans had them surrounded, and it was pretty tough. Well, 1944, Jack Pancake, it's a name you don't see a lot, or Waffle. He was Betty Haker's brother, and he grew up here in Stanford, class of 1939, and of all these guys, he was one of the probably most fightingest one of all, or a lot of them. He was with the 30th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division, which I believe your dad was also with the 3rd, with another regiment. And anyway, Jack fought the French onto the coast of Morocco, fought through Tunisia some, and then in January when FDR came to Casablanca, he and his battalion were chosen to protect FDR. and that caused him to miss out some on Tunisia, but he got to make a beach assault at Gila, Sicily, which is pretty big stuff. That was a tough one. And then they were Patton's right arm, and they made a big race to Palermo, beat Montgomery to Palermo in Sicily, and then they crossed over and they started fighting in Italy at Salerno and then north all the way through. He ended up in Anzio. Never got to get home. Betty Haker told me she was so sad. He never ever got to come home. Well, he never did. And he was at Anzio, and the Germans almost pushed through. It could have almost been disastrous on March 1st of 44. And it would have split them, and it would have taken the Germans to the beachhead. You know, John, what that would have cost. It would have been bad. Well, that's the day that the United States Army held, and that's the day that Jack Pancake got hit by an 88 directly in a foxhole, and he was killed. William Galt, the other man that was killed in Italy, of course, the Galt family's been here from the start, and his dad was Errol. He lived in Geyser until 1933, and then to Great Falls. But he, in 1942, I think it was, July of 42, he married Pat Sandbo. You guys probably know her as Pat Hansen, her teacher at Stanford, Lee Hansen's mom. So he and Pat were married during the war. William Galt goes off, and he's our most decorated, besides Mr. Shelton, our most decorated veteran. And he gets the Silver Star for taking his battalion through a minefield. He gets wounded twice, once pretty bad with shrapnel. He becomes a captain of a regiment that fights through North Africa. Not much in Sicily, I don't think, and then into Italy. He makes it all the way to Anzio about the time that Jack Pancake gets killed, and they break out of Anzio 2 months later, headed towards Rome. This is June of 1944. Normandy is going to occur that week. The fall of Rome is going to occur that week. And Saipan in the Pacific is going to occur that week. So William Galt they're under fire, they're under a bad spot. He jumps up on a tank, takes the 50 cal, I guess a good word for it is dispatches a whole group of Germans, and then is ultimately hit by a shell and killed. So the two of our most fightingest men were killed right there within 2 months, fairly close to each other, Jack and William. So I included William Galt because not too many people get the Medal of Honor. Matter of fact, Montana only had 9. And William Galt was one of them. So pretty big deal. His grandfather, the old man of like Ollie's father, and Harry and all the old man, the old grandfather, he had 7 grandsons in World War II. Lost him. So here we are in Normandy. They're fighting through there. We have a whole bunch of guys that are there right away. Omaha Beach, Carl Lindsay's there, Joseph McAllister, some others. And nobody gets killed in the whole fight all the way through, except for in the end of 1944, John Valentine from Benchland was a fireman on a railroad brigade in Paris. And he's going under a girder and got smacked. So that was how John met his maker. And then in 1944, we lost one from Wyndham in New Guinea, and one in India from his New Guinea guy was Andrew Mullen, and then we lost William Voth in India. I don't know much more about him. So 1944 goes by. One thing that's amazing, these people even survived them, but the hell ships. So as the war went on, they wanted to take the prisoners that were at least capable, and they wanted to take them on a ship all the way to Japan or China and put them in the coal mines or whatever slave labor they could. So in October, they loaded about 1,700 men on a hell ship, and they could have held about 250 maybe at max. Standing, like Alan was telling me that he'd heard from others, Roland Nelson passed on some stories, basically just standing like this, just hell. They were out in the hell ship and this is where the connection is. Jen Anderson, Oscar's wife, and she had a brother, PJ Francisco from Judith Gap. He was on this hell ship in October of 44. and then a man named Russell Cashman, who was the Mrs. Tonak, and he had two sisters here. So I thought, well, it's kind of odd. Anyway, they both ended up on this same hell ship. The Americans sunk it with a torpedo, and all 1,700 some died. So that was another tragedy, of course. So, well, we're rolling through 1944. We get to the end of 1944. We push the Germans into Belgium, basically. Market Gardens kind of failed. We didn't get to advance there. And the Battle of the Bulge occurs. December 16th, 1944. It starts. Well, as you maybe learned from the Battle of the Bulge, there was they came in fast, hard, and tough. Well, we didn't lose anybody in the Battle of the Bulge, but we had two men captured at that point. Willie Schmidt. A lot of people had heard that he was in Bataan or this and that, but I'm clearing it up right now. Willie Schmidt was right at the point of that spear, and he and about 8,000 other Americans surrendered that day. And Willie had to walk across Germany the rest of that winter, and he survived, fortunately. Another man from Ken Newton from Hobson was also with that. There were, I think, 5 other prisoners of war in Germany, a couple pilots, a couple gunners, and another infantryman, and they all survived also. So 1944 gets by, 1945, things are looking up, but it's still a hell of a fight. So the Battle of Bulge winds down, we start pushing across the Rhine. A lot of our local men were involved in the infantry units there in late Germany, or into Germany. And in the Pacific, in 1944, Saipan of June, we had one man here that was a captain in the Marine Corps. He graduated in 1935 from Stanford, named John Younglove. He had went to Quantico, he became a captain. He'd fought through the Marshall Islands, fought through all of Saipan, and on the very last day of Saipan, July 8th, they're at the point north end, the Japanese wouldn't surrender. They make a banzai charge of about 3,000 men into our guys, and about 120 Marines got killed and about 700 Army men. And that was kind of the end of Saipan right then. So we lost a man there, and then of course from Saipan in October, then the Philippines. We came out of New Guinea into the Philippines, and a lot of our men were in the Philippines, and we lost another of the class of 1935, Stanley Arnold. There were 5 Arnold brothers. So Stanley was the oldest, Albert, Ralph, who lived at Hobson, Harold, and Raymond, I believe. So imagine sending 5-year kids. Just think of that. We're pretty fortunate we haven't had to do that. And Stanley had fought all the way up through with MacArthur's army up through the islands, and he ended up in Manila in February of 1945. Manila was a brutal, terrible thing. The Japs raped it, pillaged it, wouldn't leave, just bad. Anyway, Stanley was one of the guys, he was on his tank destroyer. He ended up at the very last day of the Manila battle at the Manila Hotel and was killed right there. And that was another bad ending. Well, I didn't say this at Geyser, but Bill Thomas's aunt, her husband and her 2 children were interned over there, and basically where Stanley Arnold got killed wasn't probably a quarter mile from where they were interned and billed in prison, and then they ultimately got liberated. So she has a big diary. It's fascinating. So we go through the Philippines. The next step is Iwo Jima. That's February and March of 1945. We had one man killed on the very last day of Iwo Jima also, March 26th. Man from Buffalo, Charles Mattil, on the last Japanese charge of some fighter planes. And then we had Arthur Hill from up at Geyser, had been Bob Hill's uncle. He was on a bomber and he went down right off the coast of Iwo Jima on March 7th, I believe it was. So we lost a couple at Iwo Jima. And then in Germany about then, towards the end of March and into April, our forces had crossed the Rhine in March. They were getting into the motherland in the eastern side of the Germany, and that's when I think a lot of them really realized what they were fighting for. they started to liberate some concentration camps. And none of our men were killed there, but they were scarred there. A lot of them were very scarred there for the rest of their lives. Alan Zimmer's dad, Ivan, right there in the middle of it. Bob Evans, Geyser, right there. He saw it all. The first camp that was liberated was Ohrdorf by the Allies. It was a sub-camp of Buchenwald. That's when you've maybe seen the pictures, but Patton and Montgomery and Eisenhower all show up. Patton goes and throws up. They make him bury them all. You know what it's about. It's bad stuff. But we had several men there that saw that and had to live with that and tried hard to forget it, but they never could. So fortunately, they didn't have any loss of life in Germany. Back in the Pacific, though, Okinawa was a terrible, brutal fight, and I'm starting to wind down here towards the end. But we had two men in Okinawa, a man named Ralph Raw from Hobson, lived there most of his life anyway, and he was with the 96th Infantry Division, a place called Hacksaw Ridge. You ever hear that movie? A man named Desmond Doss, the medic that saved however many of them. Ralph was one of those that didn't make it. We had another Brownlee, Billy Brownlee. There was a William Brownlee and two William Brownlees, and it confused me for quite a while. But one was called Billy and one William. The one that survived, William Brownlee, he was a Marine Corps. All these moccasin guys were in the Marine Corps. And they went through Guadalcanal, and he survived that. And then he fought through Tarawa, and he was there, like I set up at Geyser, he and T.R. Brady and some others. But they were both at Tarawa. T.R. was a Navy corpsman right there on the beach with all kinds of death. And T.R. opened up when he was an old man and told me the story, kind of. I was able to do that, but he told me that he and William Brownlee were good friends all their lives and never spoke of it once. That's pretty standard, I think, the guys that really saw the heat. So anyway, Billy Brownlee was quite a pilot. Must have been quite a character, because he flew at Catalina. He flew thousands of hours all over the Pacific. He flew Admiral Nimitz a couple different times. He said Admiral Nimitz put his jacket over his 5 stars when he saw him. So he was the first to land in the Marshall Islands. And then May 10th of 45, off the coast of Okinawa, he went down there and lost his life. And then in June, we had one man named Harry Shine. That's a great name. He came and worked on a big ranch here at Stanford, enlisted in 39. He got the Silver Star in Guadalcanal. And then in the Philippines, he died in a truck wreck in June of 1945. And then we had John Hollenbeck from Buffalo. That had been Pat McNulty's uncle. Served as a radio man on the USS Enterprise the whole war. And at the end of the war, contracted malaria somehow and died of malaria. And then the last of our casualties, I've talked about it at one of the high school graduations, is a man named Robert Hurst. Robert Hurst was from Stanford here. He was also the class in 1935 with Stanley Almold and John Younglove. And the class picture, you know, you look at these 17, 18-year-old boys, and they only knew what was coming. Well, Lieutenant Hurst, he's a valedictorian here, and he goes to Annapolis. He graduates Annapolis. He goes through never really serves overseas. He's an instructor in Seattle through most of the war. But when they decide to take the atomic bomb on the Indianapolis to Guam to begin that process, he's chosen, and he's one of the lieutenants in charge, oddly enough, fire control on the deck of the ship. Well, the Indianapolis, it delivers an atomic bomb, and it heads towards the Philippines. It gets hit by a torpedo. It goes down. About 900 men go in the water. Normally, there'd be a Navy crew there to save them, or they at least would know about it. Somehow, that was one of the biggest screw-ups, biggest tragedies in the whole entire war. And I just found out today that Mr. Watkins, his uncle, your cousin, Rainsford, and I didn't know this. That's why I like to bring these things up, because I'm going to learn more. He survived it. He survived. All these men went in the water. They were there almost 4 days. The Navy they didn't know they were missing. Well, Lieutenant Hurst He didn't survive. So approximately 600 of them either got eaten by sharks or drowned or probably both. And that was kind of covered up and it wasn't talked about much, but it was the very last ship that was sunk in the war, and it was truly a tragedy. Probably shouldn't have happened that way. They should have rescued him. But Mrs. Hurst, who later became Mrs. Sorensen, she established a scholarship fund when she was near her death in the late 70s, the Hearst Sorensen Scholarship here at Stanford. And I think they give around 50 to 60,000 a year now for scholarships, and have for, well, since then. So pretty big deal. And you know, the bomb gets dropped, Japan surrenders. We don't have to invade the main island, fortunately, I guess. Question whether it was right or not. Well, my dad was on a minesweeper and started in early 1945, and he ended up in Nagasaki about 2 weeks after the bomb was dropped. And then he got to see Hiroshima too, about in the end of October. And he always thought it was the right thing to do. I don't know. So that's a question we chew on a lot. So Wendell Hansen was also there up at Rainsford. You know how good looking Wendell was? Big, tall, good looking guy. He was on a PT boat like John Kennedy. And I thought, hell, he could have been just like John Kennedy. He was better looking. So he saw it all, and he wrote a real good letter to the press, and there was a lot of information in the newspapers, just little stories and stuff, and I'm kind of trying to put them together, trying to get a gathering of all this. But that's the group of our killed in action men. They truly, you know, they didn't get to come see green grass again. They didn't have families. They never got to live their lives. So I think we truly do owe a lot to those people, and the others too. So up at Geyser, I told this story, and some of you may have known Tim McAllister, probably. The McAllister family sent 5 to the war, and I don't think probably the tallest one was this tall. And I got to know Tim, and I went up and I got to interview him, and he's telling me that he had to be 5'2" and 110 pounds to get in. Tim was 5'2" and 112. Like a rock in his pocket. But he got in, and he fought through the Philippines and got a Bronze Star. Ended up in Tokyo, and with all the other allies, they occupied Tokyo. And of course, what are you going to do when the cowboys arrive? You're going to have a rodeo. John Lilligard got me the pamphlet of the Tokyo Rodeo.
Oh, wow.
November of 1945, the real deal. So they've got some kind of arena there, and some of you may have, you know, throughout the war, Emperor Hirohito, of course, he's the divine emperor of Japan, and he's truly a divine god to the Japanese. So in part of the surrender, they left him in place, kind of. You know, they didn't have to depose the emperor, so the Allies kind of let that happen. And all through the war, Emperor Hirohito had this great, big, beautiful white horse. He'd prance over the troops, you know how they do, and looking good with some kind of big feathery hat on. And so we had an admiral called Bull Halsey, who was one of our main Navy admirals. And he was kind of a blustery, kind of fighting kind of guy. And all through the war, he'd puff his chest out and say, I'm going to get to Japan, I'm going to ride that goddamn horse. Well, Bull Halsey never got to ride that horse, but Tim McAllister did. So they're at the Tokyo Rodeo, all going on, you know, probably pretty crazy. And in the back is Hirohito's horse, this white horse. And Tim's sitting there in my camera telling me like a little 90 or 85-year-old leprechaun, telling me the story about it. And he says, yep, these soldiers are back there trying to ride this horse, and they're getting bucked off, and none of them can ride it. And he said, yeah, I'll get on him. Old Timmy McAllister jumped on him and ran him up and down the backyard, got him all lathered up, and next thing this is what he said, Tim said, he said, next thing I heard was Captain Ryan, who's he's in that program with that horse, so it kind of legitimized the whole thing when I got the deal. He said, Captain Ryan says, get that soldier off that goddamn horse or we're going to start World War III. So Timmy got to ride the horse, and we had men like Bob Lilligard, who's this nice little mild-mannered science teacher. He ends up in Birch's Garden and takes one of Hitler's pistols. So our men kept going, and they ended up at the end of the war, and they all survived except for these ones I talked about. and life went on. And we're free. We have liberty. And I think we truly need to remember these. That's kind of got me fired up, just to try to tell the story and to try to gather their histories. So if any of you have stuff that, I'm looking for pictures, anything, I'm kind of trying to gather it. So feel free to get a hold of me. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.